Hi, I'm Dr. Jennifer Chandler in the Leadership and Integrative Studies Unit at Arizona State University. This toolkit video addresses source selection as it relates to project management. Many organizational projects involve some sort of procurement, and source selection is a process through which a purchaser analyzes options and makes a procurement decision. This brief video focuses on the United States federal government source selection by giving a high-level overview of it and then delves into two recent research studies on those procurement practices and the recommendations that resulted from those studies. The federal regulations that govern source selection used in the United States government contracting are thoroughly addressed in the Federal Acquisition Regulations, or FAR. The expression source selection can also refer to the procurement process that any for-profit or not-for-profit organization may engage in as part of a project, and each organization will have its own terminology, processes, and standards. Additionally, the 7th edition of the Project Management Institute's Guide to Project Management Body of Knowledge, otherwise known as the PMBOK, no longer provides predictive steps addressing the procurement process for project managers. So that's why this video focuses on the U.S. federal government source selection. There hasn't been much research conducted on the United States federal government source selection process, but there are these two recent studies that were completed that provide insights and recommendations. Let's look into each of these. This research team examined 124 contracts completed by the United States Navy and the United States Air Force that had an average price of about $26 million. They were interested in comparing the trade-off method of source selection and the low-price technically acceptable method in three key areas: the time needed to complete the source selection, the size of the team needed to do that, and the eventual performance scores about the selected suppliers. Here is where those two source selection methods that were the focus of the study appear in the FAR listing we briefly looked at. And this is what the best value continuum states. An agency can obtain best value in negotiated acquisitions by using any one or a combination of source selection approaches. In different types of acquisitions, the relative importance of cost or price may vary. For example, in acquisitions where the requirement is clearly definable and the risk of unsuccessful contract performance is minimal, cost or price may play a dominant role in the source selection. The less definitive the requirement, the more development work required, or the greater the performance risk, the more technical or past performance considerations may play a dominant role in the source selection. This research was prompted because, as we just read from the FAR, it's a judgment call that a decision maker must make to choose one of these methods. And there are some who would argue that the low-price, technically acceptable method is a quicker process, but that it results in choosing suppliers who provide inferior products and services, or that it stifles innovation. And they argue that the trade-off method can address those problems. There are also proponents of the low-price, technically acceptable method who argue that it is more objective and results in fewer procurement protests. The research found that the trade-off method required a larger selection team and took longer, but it also resulted in higher supplier performance scores than the low-price technically acceptable method. These research results can inform procurement decision makers in deciding which method to use. Now let's look at the GAO research study. This study gleaned procurement practices from 7 for-profit organizations that agreed to participate in their study. And they also gathered input from 4 professional associations, 5 universities, and 2 independent experts. These researchers acknowledged the inherent differences between federal organizations and for-profit organizations. For example, in for-profit organizations, the focus is on profit margins and return on investment, while the focus in federal government organizations is on appropriate stewardship of public funds. But the researchers also argued that there are several similarities that made this a worthwhile study. The research team used the practices they gleaned from the private sector to assess the procurement practices employed in 6 federal organizations. They identified these 3 key procurement management practices that were generally used in the private sector companies. Performance metrics are developed in collaboration with internal stakeholders, particularly end users. The performance metrics used to manage their organizations are outcome-oriented. And performance metrics are linked to strategic goals. The results of this study were mixed. They discovered that in the federal agencies examined, performance metrics were not developed in collaboration with internal stakeholders. And there wasn't full implementation of outcome-oriented performance metrics in any of the organizations that were part of this study. However, all of the organization studies had performance metrics linked to their strategic goals. So what did these research studies recommend about source selection? Collaboration. One of the main avenues for collaborating with the source selection process that a project manager has available is through the source selection criteria. Outcomes. Procurement outcomes deserve attention in the drive to improve organizational procurement processes. Otherwise, organizations can continue to invest in processes that are not generating outcomes that support the organization's strategic goals. Project managers can contribute to the development of those outcome measures. Time. Unfortunately, there is typically time pressure on a source selection process, and the people involved in source selection teams could be performing source selection tasks that are unfamiliar to them, so time is one of their most important resources. Project managers involved in source selections benefit from recognizing and planning for time-related contingencies arising from the procurement process. That wraps up this toolkit video. I'm Dr. Jennifer Chandler in the Leadership in Integrative Studies at Arizona State University. Thank you.